He mailed pieces of his victims to newspapers. He wrote to the police, mocking them. He called in his own murders to the Vallejo Police Department while the bodies were still warm. He wore a hood with his own symbol stitched onto it. He walked up to two people in broad daylight, tied them up, stabbed them like he was doing a job, and then just walked away. Not running, walking. He was never caught. He was never charged. He was never named by any police department in America. For 56 years, the man who called himself the Zodiac Killer remained the most taunting, most theatrical, most terrifying unsolved mystery in American criminal history. But in 2024, something changed. An artificial intelligence was given every single piece of evidence that had ever existed in this case. Every letter, every cipher, every crime scene report, every suspect file, every handwriting sample, every geographic data point, all of it, and told to do one thing: find what 56 years of human investigation missed. When it finished running every variable simultaneously, one name came back, not as one possibility among many, but as the overwhelming statistical answer. A name that had been sitting in those case files for decades, looked at briefly and then set aside, because the man didn't quite fit the profile investigators had built. A house painter from Vallejo, California, who died in 2018 without ever answering a single question. Today, I want to take you through the complete story, from the very first murder to the AI analysis, to exactly where the evidence stands right now. Because this isn't a simple story, and anyone who tells you it is isn't being straight with you. The Zodiac case began on a cold December night in 1968, the 20th of December, on a 2-lane road outside the small city of Benicia in Northern California, called Lake Herman Road. 17-year-old Betty Lou Jensen and 16-year-old David Faraday drove out there on their very first date. She told her parents she'd be home by 11. They parked in a gravel turnout. What happened next unfolded in minutes and left almost nothing behind. The vehicle pulled in close. A man got out. No robbery, no warning. David Faraday was shot once in the head at point-blank range as he tried to get out of the car. Betty Lou Jensen ran. She made it perhaps 30 feet across the dark ground before she was shot 5 times in the back. 5 bullets fired into a running, terrified 17-year-old girl on her first date. When they were found, there was no weapon, no witness, no connection between the killer and the victims. Just 2 young bodies on a cold roadside in a county that had absolutely no idea what it was dealing with. He waited nearly 7 months. Then, on the 4th of July, 1969, in the city of Vallejo, a 22-year-old waitress named Darlene Farine and a 19-year-old named Michael Majot drove to Blue Rock Springs Park, a quiet spot away from the holiday noise. A car pulled in behind them, left, then came back. A detail that told investigators something important later, suggesting a hunter circling, making sure. A man approached the driver's side with a bright flashlight and a pistol and opened fire without a word. Darlene Farrin was fatally wounded. Michael Majot was shot multiple times and left for dead. But against every odd, he survived. And for the first time, someone who had looked directly at the Zodiac lived to describe him. A stocky white male, heavy-set, in his late 20s or early 30s, with a large face and short hair. That description would drive the investigation for the next 5 decades. And it would ultimately, in one of the most critical ways, point investigators toward the wrong assumptions. 40 minutes after the shooting, before any news of it had broken publicly, a man called the Vallejo Police Department. In a flat, controlled voice, he told the dispatcher he wished to report a double murder. He gave the location. Then he said something that stopped the room cold. He claimed the December murders on Lake Herman Road as his own work too. 2 crime scenes, months and miles apart, that no one had publicly connected. He linked them himself, offering details only the shooter could have known, then hung up before the call could be traced. The police were no longer chasing an isolated tragedy. They were chasing something that was chasing them back. On the 1st of August, 1969, 3 separate envelopes arrived at 3 different Bay Area newspapers. Each contained a portion of a longer message, and each carried a threat. Publish this on the front page, or I will go on a killing spree this weekend and cut down a dozen people. Inside each envelope was also a piece of a cipher, 48 symbols long. A wall of strange characters the writer claimed held his true identity. He believed no one could break it. He was wrong about that one. A high school teacher named Donald Harden and his wife Betty, working at their kitchen table, cracked the code by hand in about a week. No computers, just patience, pencil, and the logic of language patterns. And what came out of those symbols was a message that revealed how this killer thought. He boasted that killing was the most thrilling thing he had ever experienced, more thrilling than anything else in life. He wrote that everyone he murdered would become his slave in the afterlife, servants he was collecting for some world beyond this one. And at the bottom of the letter, for the first time, there was the symbol, a circle crossed by a vertical and a horizontal line, like the crosshairs of a gun sight, the mark that would define him, the birth in ink and in blood of the name Zodiac. But he wasn't done performing. On September 27th, 1969, at a place called Lake Berryessa, he arrived wearing something no witness would ever forget. Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard, two college students, were relaxing by the water on a warm Saturday afternoon. They noticed a man in the distance walking toward them. He drifted behind a tree, and they thought little of it. But when he emerged again, he was wearing a black executioner-style hood that fell across his chest with slits cut for his eyes, and stitched or drawn onto the fabric over his heart was that same crossed circle symbol, worn now like a coat of arms. He told them he was an escaped convict who needed their car and money to get to Mexico. He had Cecilia bind Brian's hands, then bound Cecilia himself. For a few moments, it seemed like a robbery, survivable. And then, without raising his voice, without any signal at all, he drew a knife and began to stab them. He stabbed Brian Hartnell repeatedly in the back. He stabbed Cecilia Shepard many more times, methodically, like he was completing a task on a checklist rather than attacking a human being. Then he walked away. He did not run. He walked. He went to their car and wrote on the door with a felt marker the dates of his previous attacks, the words, "by knife," and above them, the symbol. He was signing the scene the way a painter signs a canvas. Brian Hartnell survived. Cecilia Shepard did not, and before the ambulances had even finished their work, a man called the police from a payphone in a nearby town and calmly claimed it. When investigators lifted a palm print from that phone, they had physical evidence at last, but no matching hand to press it against. 2 weeks later, he changed cities and methods again. October 11th, 1969. A cab driver named Paul Stein picked up a fare in downtown San Francisco. The passenger asked to be taken to Presidio Heights. When the cab stopped at the corner of Washington and Cherry Streets, the passenger raised a pistol and shot Paul Stein once in the head at point-blank range. But this time, there were witnesses. A group of teenagers watching from a house across the street saw the killer lean over the body, tear a section from Paul Stein's blood-soaked shirt, wipe down parts of the cab, unhurried, then step out and walk north into the darkness of the Presidio. Not running, walking. The composite sketch that emerged from their descriptions became one of the most reproduced faces in American criminal history. A white male, heavy-set, wearing glasses, with short reddish-brown hair. An ordinary-looking man you might pass in a hardware store without a second glance. That very night, patrol officers had stopped and spoken to a man on foot near the scene, but a description broadcast over police radio had wrongly described the suspect as black, and so the officers let the man continue on his way. It was one of several moments across those terrible months when the Zodiac stood within arm's reach of law enforcement and simply slipped through, protected less by cunning than by the gap between what people expected the killer to look like and what he actually was. 3 days after Paul Stein died, a letter arrived at a San Francisco newspaper with a piece of blood-stained fabric inside, a swatch cut from Paul Stein's shirt, offered as grim proof of authorship, a receipt for murder. The letter taunted the police for letting him walk away that night, and it was signed for the first time in full with the name he had chosen for himself, Zodiac. He had a symbol, a body count, an unbroken record of escape. Now he had a title. He was no longer a suspect, he was a character. Over the years that followed, more letters came. Some contained new ciphers, some contained crime details or claims of new victims that could never be confirmed. A Halloween card, a threat to blow up a school bus full of children, complete with a hand-drawn wiring diagram showing how he would rig the explosives and pick off the survivors as they fled. He referenced movies. He referenced songs. He wrote with a strange, mocking playfulness laid over an abyss of casual cruelty, misspelling the same words the same way every single time, as if the errors were themselves a kind of fingerprint he couldn't help leaving. He claimed his victim count kept rising. 37, he wrote once, keeping a running score against a police force that couldn't even confirm his name. And then, in the middle of the 1970s, the letters began to thin, to slow, and finally to stop. The great silence of the Zodiac case began. For decades, that silence held. Detectives retired with the files still open on their desks. Some carried it to their graves. New investigators inherited boxes of paper. Thousands of suspects were looked at and cleared. Millions of dollars were spent. DNA technology arrived and solved cold cases far older than this one. Yet still, the Zodiac remained a ghost. The case didn't suffer from a shortage of evidence. It suffered from an excess of it. A mountain of documents, dates, handwriting samples, geographic markers, and behavioral details that no team of humans could ever fully cross-reference at the same time. Because human investigators work in sequence. They follow one lead, then another. By the time they reach the 10th lead, the details of the first have already begun to blur. They build a profile, a stocky man in his late 20s or early 30s, the age Michael Mageau described on that terrible July night, and without meaning to, they begin to measure every suspect against that profile, quietly discarding the ones who don't fit. It's not laziness. It's how the human mind works under the weight of too much information. But in this case, that very instinct became the killer's best protection. Because somewhere in those files, the connections were already there. The clues had been documented. The patterns were visible on the page. They simply needed to be seen all at once by something that wouldn't tire, wouldn't assume, and wouldn't flinch from a pattern just because it pointed somewhere unexpected. For 56 years, no such thing existed. Then, in 2024, someone decided to try an experiment. An artificial intelligence system, a machine built to recognize patterns across enormous and chaotic sets of data, was given the complete Zodiac case archive. Not a summary, not the highlights, the entire thing, every letter, every cipher, every witness statement, every geographic coordinate, every suspect file, every scrap of handwriting, every timeline ever assembled by human hands. And it was given one open-ended instruction: find the patterns human investigators might have missed. Don't assume anything about who the killer was. Don't privilege one theory over another. Simply look at all of it simultaneously and report what you see. What the machine did wasn't detective work in any way a human would recognize. It didn't have hunches. It didn't get tired. It didn't fall in love with a favorite suspect and bend the evidence to fit. It processed every variable at the same time. The loops and slants of the handwriting, the exact placement of the misspellings, the geographic center of the crimes, the timing of every letter measured against calendars and public records, the linguistic fingerprints buried in the taunting prose. It cross-referenced these against databases of population data, known suspects, writing samples pulled from employment records, DMV files, and military paperwork. It ran comparisons that would have taken a room full of analysts a lifetime to complete. And it didn't care in the slightest what the answer turned out to be. When it finished, one name rose above every other, with a statistical gap so large the difference itself was alarming. The name was Gary Francis Post, an Air Force veteran turned house painter who had lived in the Bay Area throughout the exact years when the Zodiac was active. A man who was not a recluse, not a phantom, an ordinary-looking man you would pass without a second glance. His name had been in the files the whole time. It had surfaced briefly decades earlier and then been set aside because the man was a little too old. He didn't quite fit the profile built around Michael Mageau's frightened estimate on that July night. And so, like the man walking calmly through Presidio Heights while patrol cars rolled past, he'd been allowed to slip through the gap between expectation and reality. The machine had no expectations to slip through. It saw only the data. The AI analysis began with handwriting because that's where the Zodiac had left the most of himself. The system pulled everything it could find bearing Post's hand. Employment forms filled out in block letters, DMV paperwork, personal notes, signatures across decades of ordinary life. Then it laid those samples against the letters that had terrorized Northern California. It measured letter formations, the precise spacing between words, the angle of every stroke, the way certain characters connected and others stood apart, the variations in pressure where the pen bore down and where it lifted. Hundreds of microscopic features, each one quantified. And feature after feature, the correlation held. The AI reported alignment across more than 90 distinct measurable characteristics between Post's known writing and the Zodiac's letters, a level of overlap calculated to occur by pure chance less than one time in 10 million. The Zodiac had misspelled certain words in a consistent, idiosyncratic way, the same error surfacing again and again across years of correspondence. The word paradise misspelled as paradis, the word slaves used repeatedly in the context of his afterlife beliefs. Poste, in his own unrelated writing, made those very same spelling mistakes. He used distinctive turns of phrase echoing the letters. His writing reflected the same level of education, the same cultural references, the same odd mixture of crudeness and strange cleverness that had always made the Zodiac so difficult to place. It was as if two voices, separated by decades and by the deliberate intent to remain hidden, had been revealed to be one.